It's a great pleasure to be here. It's quite a daunting prospect to be opening this conference, but hopefully I shall get things off to a bit of a start with precisely what Mark was saying at the start, with a bit of empirical context, a bit of empirical discussion of some of the historical background to issues of data privacy and data commercialization. And also to focus on, or to bring to light, precisely what historians and sociologists love, which is the complexity of these kinds of issues. So I do want to look at issues of privatization, commercialization versus public interest and public configurations of research especially, but to try and problematize some of these issues a bit as well, and not simply take for granted what we mean by public and private. And I'm going to be talking about the development from the 1970s, really, of research in the area of genomics and in genetic technologies related to healthcare. I'm not going to be talking much about personal data and healthcare data. I'm not going to be talking much about medical systems, but I will, I hope, raise some issues that will relate to some of those concerns that we can maybe pick up at the end. So, questions of what is public and what is private in relation to genomics and in relation to biotechnology really start to emerge as a key area of debate, of concern, of negotiation in the 1970s, with the beginnings of the emergence of the new biotechnology industries. Industries based especially on new technologies, recombinant DNA technologies, which emerged in the 1970s, and I won't say much about this, but also things like monoclonal antibodies, which were also emerging around that time. So powerful new technologies, which from very early on were seen as having the potential to deliver new kinds of medical products or new ways of delivering old medical products. So a powerful new technology, but going along with that, and in interaction with that, very importantly, a whole set of changes in the intellectual property regime, which made it possible for the patenting of new kinds of life forms, recombinant life forms, new kinds of processes of biological recombination and so on. And increasingly, and I'll move on to this in a moment, the patenting also of biological data, and especially genomic data. So the key moments in this come with the granting of a patent to Ananda Chakrabarty in 1980 for modified, though not recombinant, bacteria, and in the same year the granting of patents, and then in 1980, 82, 84, patents to Stanley Cohen and Herbert Boyer for the basic technologies of recombinant DNA and the creation of recombinant organisms. But this was the culmination in many ways of a long set of debates over the patentability of life forms, and over as well the commercialization of biological research and the establishment of these new companies, Genentech, Biogen, Cetus, various others, coming in an increasingly rapid wave from the late 1970s, created new forms of commercial life in which research was done in a commercial context with often venture capital funding, aimed at the production of patented technologies that could then be commercialized. And this marked a very significant shift in certain areas of biomedical research, the emergence of these new forms of life within an academic culture of molecular biology that up until then had been marked by what historians, sociologists have called a gift economy, of sharing of information, of reagents, of organisms, in a circulation of gifting from one center, one scientist to another. This was then replaced in these companies by an increasing tendency to view reagents, organisms, not as things that could be shared freely and could be gifted from one laboratory to another, not a process of gift exchange, but things that were owned commercially and that could be exchanged through contractual arrangements and through financial arrangements. So we get a marked shift from a gift economy of sharing in academic laboratories to a system of commercial exchange based in these new biotech startup companies. And this was a very controversial process, and a lot of very heated debate amongst scientists about the ethics, about the propriety of patenting of biological research. That debate, to a considerable extent, did die down by the 1980s as it became clear that commercial sources of funding were very valuable for conducting biotechnological research, molecular biology, and a lot of this faded out. But some of the issues about privacy versus public or collective ownership did persist. Just a couple of things to emphasize about this shift. First of all, I want to make clear that the changes towards the commercialization of biotechnology didn't take place just within the sphere of biotechnology itself. It was part of a much wider rethinking of the public goods that were delivered by publicly funded research and how those public goods were best brought to fruition. And this included debate in politics, in economics, in intellectual property law about how public goods are best delivered. And a growing body of opinion, particularly amongst economists at that time, the Chicago School of Economists, that the best way to deliver public good is through commercialization. And the language at this time, particularly the model of the tragedy of the commons, the idea that, looking back to the 17th century, the commons, the public spaces of agricultural resource, were not properly exploited because nobody had an interest in commercializing or exploiting them, and there was a tendency to overgraze the commons. The tragedy of the commons was held up as a model of the failure of collective public ownership, and commercialization was held up as the way to deliver good for the public in terms of economic growth, in terms of the delivery of new products. And this view secured very widespread political support, particularly in the United States, and particularly with political shifts that were going on then that would lead to the appointment of the election of Reagan as president. Here in the UK, moves towards the election of the Thatcher government. Also very strongly supported by the pharmaceutical industry, who at that time were worried about their profitability, still smarting somewhat from the introduction of new regulatory regimes in the wake of thalidomide and so on and so forth. So the pharmaceutical industry also joined in very forcefully in saying we need to have patenting of biological research so that we can then commercialize it in order to deliver new products, new public goods. The other thing I want to say is just that I'm not setting out in any way to presume either that public ownership of biological goods or private ownership is inherently better than the other. I don't want to idealize or romanticize in particular the idea of gift exchange as some kind of utopian communism within science, because it's very clear that whatever system of circulation of products, of goods you have, gift exchange, face-to-face interactions between scientists and the gifting of goods is as much a way of excluding as a way of including. And it's very clear that, for instance, many of the new biotechnology companies were seen as much more productive sites and much more egalitarian sites to do biological research, good academic biological research, than was the case, for instance, in hidebound academia. It was more open to women, it was more open to minorities, it was more open to talent. So there are pros and cons on both sides of the argument, and I don't want to romanticize the scientific public academia. These tensions start to play out as well in other ways. For instance, through the 1980s in publicly funded research. I mean, it's very well known that from the 1980s, with the emergence of the Human Genome Project, there was very strong commitment amongst many publicly funded scientists to public sharing of genomic data, and particularly sequence data, as sequence data started to become increasingly important as, if you like, part of the currency of big scientific research, human genome research. Very strong commitments to ensuring that publicly funded scientists placed their data, their sequence data, in public repositories. And we see the growth of a number of public repositories precisely for this purpose. GenBank, the European Molecular Biology Lab, and the DNA Databank of Japan. The availability of these public repositories of data is absolutely crucial to the growth of big science, genomics as a big science, the Human Genome Project as a massive and massively coordinated process of research. The free movement of data through these biobanks and data banks is crucial. But it's also important to note that this is within the public sphere of biological data, but this too, although ostensibly simply a continuation of the economy of gift exchange, actually raises all sorts of tensions. Because among other things, the way that data has circulated previously in a more sort of bottom-up approach to biological research, genomic research, has been structured around the interests of small centres, small sequencing centres, small research centres. Many of these smaller centres had particular interests in the way that they used the data, in the kind of formatting of the data, in the way that they held on to it for long enough to be able to publish it, to be able to get their work into the public sphere and gain credit for it. The issues of value and credit are really very important here. Issues also about the way that small centres were often focusing on particular kinds of questions where they needed particular kinds of data. They needed to accumulate sufficient data before they could then publish their research findings on particular topics. Whereas for the big genome centres, the key issue was mass throughput of data. What they wanted to publish was large amounts of data and large amounts of data analysis. So there's a tension, even within the public sphere, between the interests of small centres and the interests of the big data-rich, data-intensive organisations involved in the Human Genome Project. So we can't just think of public ownership of data as some sort of uniform system of sharing and of exchange. There are different interests, even within the public system, in the way that data is used, data is mobilised, data is published, and credit accrues to different people within that economy of the movement of data. That's public data. At the same time, within the biotech industry, increasingly data itself is becoming patentable. Initially, the first biotech patents are ostensibly on products and processes, on material products, things like recombinant processes for producing insulin and for producing human growth hormone, various other material products. But importantly, to be able to claim those as novel inventions, patenting has also always required a degree of specifiability about exactly what the invention is. And DNA sequence data was from the beginning crucial in specifying what those inventions were. So if you look at the early patents on, for instance, human insulin, they include DNA sequence data about what the gene is or what the genetic sequence is that is being reproduced, that is being cloned, and that is producing the insulin. So data is central to patents from the start. But increasingly, through the course of the 1980s, those data start to become, to have in effect a life of their own. Sequence data itself becomes increasingly patentable. For instance, especially as you move towards the development of new diagnostic technologies, not technologies for producing insulin and other proteins, but technologies for identifying genetic variants for diagnostic purposes, the genetic sequence becomes the crucial aspect of that patent, of the claim to property and the claim to have invented something. And there's an interesting ambiguity that these patent debates and patent cases sort of play off. So DNA is patentable initially, ostensibly, as a new composition of matter. The idea that you can isolate DNA sequences, you can actually have the physical thing there. It's a new composition of matter. But it's also a sequence of data points, and increasingly the data becomes dematerialized. So that by the time you get the patenting of Myriad's BRCA patents, 1994 and 1995 that should be, patenting the sequence for 2 genes that predispose to breast cancer. Crucial there is patenting of the sequence itself. And this becomes a key case, I'll come back to it a little bit later on, in issues around public versus private ownership. Not so much because it's about patenting data or patenting a gene. The key issues around the Myriad patents are the ways in which Myriad then uses its patents to very aggressively control what can be done with that genomic data. So they insist that all testing has to be done in their own laboratories. The UK is a little different in this respect, but in the United States at least they insist on testing within their own laboratories. And they insist that those genetic data cannot be used for research purposes except under very, very strict licensing constraints. So there are very strict constraints placed on the use of genomic data. So we get 2 tendencies, one towards the public ownership of sequence data in particular through the 1980s and into the 1990s, reinforced with things like the Bermuda Agreement in 1996, the Fort Lauderdale Agreement 2003, that the principle of public ownership of genetic data and genomic data is very strongly asserted. On the other hand, we get this growing culture of private ownership, commercial ownership, of certain bits, at least, of genomic and genetic data. And this interest in private ownership grows only the more strongly through the 1990s as we move on from genes for the identification of genes for rare genetic diseases to the expectations of being able to identify risk genes for common complex disorders, as the identification of those genes comes to be seen as important for predicting drug response, for instance, and becomes involved in clinical research, clinical trials. It's very much taken up by those interested in pharmacogenomics, and also increasingly important for drug discovery. So genomic data starts to come to be seen to have ever more plentiful, ever more important commercial value. It comes to be seen as itself ever more commercializable. And we get in the early 1990s the establishment of a new wave of commercial biotech companies and biotech initiatives that are concerned especially with owning and selling genomic data. Companies that see simply owning the data and being able to sell it on as a commercial proposition. The data themselves become objects of ownership, which can then be sold on to the expectation, the business model is that these can be sold on to other companies for purposes of drug discovery. So companies like Insight, Human Genome Science, Millennium Pharmaceuticals, all set up to produce genomic data and then sell it commercially. And this leads to some very interesting tensions, not necessarily between public and private ownership, but especially amongst those working in private companies. The private sector itself starts to become divided over what is the best model of ownership of data. I mean, one of the first cases actually originates in the public sector. in 1992, Craig Venter, who was then working as a publicly funded scientist at the National Institutes of Health, came up with a means of effectively mechanically sequencing, mass sequencing, what are called express sequence tags. Small lengths of DNA sequence that were known to be involved in the production of proteins. They were identified from metabolically active cells that could be sequenced, that was too small to be able to say what sort of protein, to say anything interesting about the protein that they coded for, but that were long enough to be unique to particular proteins. So express sequence tags became a way in which you can say, we know there's a protein out there, we know this chunk of DNA contributes to coding for it, and we know that this is a unique marker of that protein. The National Institutes of Health Office of Commercialization got together with Venter, so this again is a public initiative, and said let's patent these, because these are going to be commercially valuable, or some of them at least are likely to be commercially valuable. That led to an outcry amongst scientists who said, publicly funded scientists who said, no, this is a step too far, we don't know anything about these, because of the mechanical way in which these could be, ESTs could be produced in huge numbers and patented in huge numbers. They said this is an enormous enclosure of our scientific commons. This is going to tie up science in ways that will restrict hugely what we can do. And NIH backed down. Venter then left the National Institutes of Health, went off to establish a non-profit organization, the Institute of Genome Research, which worked in partnership with a for-profit company, Human Genome Sciences, which the partnership was that Venter would produce EST data, Human Genome Sciences would patent and commercialize them. So what didn't fly in the public sector moved with Venter into the private sector. And this led to concern amongst at least some pharmaceutical companies who were increasingly worried now that the sheer scale of patenting of genomic data was leading to patent thickets, was leading to a proliferation of transaction costs as licensing agreements and multiple licensing agreements had to be undertaken, had to be entered into to conduct any research. A sense amongst private and especially big pharmaceutical companies that this was actually going to put a block on research. Research not just of interest to the public, but also to commercial companies. And Merck, the pharmaceutical company Merck, stepped in after Venter had moved over to set up the Institute of Genome Research and said, right, we are going to set up in competition with you our own EST data bank, and we will make those data publicly available. So Venter can do what he likes, he can commercialize, but we will do what we can to beat him in terms of churning out EST data and making them publicly available in the public interest, but also in the interest of pharmaceutical companies like Merck. A similar move occurred in 1995 when SmithKline Beecham formed a consortium, again with Human Genome Sciences, to patent human genome sequence data. And again, Merck stepped in to sponsor a group of academic researchers at Washington University to sequence human genome data and to place those data in public repositories, to make them publicly available. So we now see a split within the private sector between those companies, especially small biotechnology startups, who see their interests residing in the private ownership and commercialization of genomic data, and the big companies who think that a proliferation of private companies, small private companies, all owning bits of data is going to make their their own research too complicated, too financially difficult, too legally difficult. And so within the private sphere, we see different ideas about what should be public and what should be private, and in whose interests that works. And this then leads on to the establishment of new kinds of public-private partnerships. And probably most visibly here in July 1997, or following on from this. In July 1997, Abbott Laboratories, who are, among other things, a very big producer of diagnostics, commercial diagnostics, strike a deal with a company, another biotech company in Paris, Genset, partly run by Stanley Cohen, who holds the first ever recombinant DNA patent. They'd strike a $40 million deal to create and patent a database now of SNP markers, single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are seen by the late 1990s to be increasingly important for the identification, especially of genes for common complex disorders. So crucial now to the expectation that genomics is going to tell us about diseases like heart disease and cancer, and will lead to new treatments, new diagnostics and new treatments. So that's one program, massively funded, to create and patent this kind of genomic data, SNP data. A similar deal was struck around about the same time between the Whitehead Institute at Harvard University, the drug company Bristol Myers Squibb, and two startups, Millennium Pharmaceuticals, which is another startup concerned particularly with producing and commercializing genomic data, and Affymetrix, who were looking for to produce, they become one of the first producers of gene SNP chips. Diagnostic technologies aimed at identifying large numbers of gene variants in single samples. So again, around about $40 million, again, looking to create a database of human SNP data. And at this point, we get the establishment of a much larger scale initiative funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute in the United States, NIH funding. In the UK, the Wellcome Trust, who has funded a large part of the Human Genome Project, also steps in with substantial funding, and a number of large pharmaceutical companies, including SmithKline Beecham, who had been involved in the early initiative with Human Genome Sciences, now decide that a public-private partnership is the way to go forward to collect, identify, and make publicly available SNP data on a huge scale. And the SNP consortium becomes really, in many ways, a very important exemplar of, if you like, this first wave of consortium working between public and private organizations. Very big buy-in from the big pharmaceutical companies and also from those publicly funding the Human Genome Project. So again, I mean, the important thing I think to make clear here is that this is very much about a perception which spans the public and private divides, that certain kinds of data, genomic data at least, can only be properly, the value of them can only be, or can best be realized if those data are held in the public sphere and are available publicly to anybody who wants to use them. And these initiatives are, in the event, very successful. The SNP consortium and the publication of the SNP database effectively, and other projects that go on around the same time, that grow out of it, the International HapMap project, for instance, are very successful in deflating the commercial value of certain kinds, at least, of human genome data. So just to give an example, in August 2000, Craig Venter, now working with his company Celera, launches its own proprietary SNP database, inventor thinks that his technology is still fast enough to steal a march on the SNP consortium, and he'll be able to produce a proprietary SNP database that will be commercially valuable. By May 2005, he's realized that's not going to work, that the publicly available SNP data effectively means that his SNP database, his commercial database, is pretty much valueless. And so Celera announced in May 2005 that it's going to close its proprietary genomic information service, and it will make the genome data available through existing databases. So in that case at least, public-private initiative manages to pull the rug out from underneath organizations like Celera who want commercial ownership. And all of this leads as well to, it's accompanied by debate at the time in more, not just in terms of commercial strategy, which is obviously a very big part of this, but by debate amongst lawyers and economists about what is the proper extent of public or private ownership of genomic data, and what is the best way to deliver public benefit from particularly publicly funded research. And we see, among other things at this time, a resurgence of the language of the commons. So where in the 1970s Chicago school economists were waving the example of the tragedy of the commons as a strong argument and a very widely accepted argument for commercialization of scientific research, we start to see a resurgence of interest in the importance, the value of the commons. The commons no longer looks quite so tragic, at least in certain areas. It's seen to be, common ownership is seen to be a way in which it becomes valuable for delivering value of one sort or another, including the pursuit of health research. And this also plays through, I think not directly but indirectly, in decisions actually about what is patentable, what might be patented. So in 2005, for instance, the federal court in the United States, I realise that most of my examples have been focused in the United States. There are sort of similar echoes of this going on in Europe as well, in the UK, but the key cases really take place in the US. In 2005, the federal court, which is responsible for patent appeals, decides that ESTs are not patentable, although they are very similar to genes and to other kinds of genomic data. The court decides that in the absence of any understanding of what these actually code for and what the proteins that they code for actually do, in the absence of any functional understanding, these can't be counted as discoveries, they can't be counted as novel inventions. So ESTs are excluded from patenting. And then in a very high-profile series of cases in 2010 to 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States reconsiders the BRCA patents, Myriad's BRCA patents, and in a series of decisions disqualifies those genes from patentability. And the ostensible reason that's given is that since human DNA is a product of nature, it cannot be patented. It's not eligible for patenting. But that's not been a problem for the previous 25 years. The turnaround really comes because the cases that are made by a wide range of friends of the court, of interested parties, are that the way that the BRCA patents have been enforced actually restricts research and is contrary to the further process of discovery and invention, and is contrary to the public good and to the expectation, the constitutional expectation in the US Patent Act, that patents should encourage discovery and should encourage invention, should not discourage it. And this is fundamental to the way that the BRCA patents are seen to be disqualified. So I've been trying to push the point that we need to think not just about sort of public and private in any kind of polarized terms, and the values of publicity or privateness or commercialization in any kinds of sort of abstract and absolute terms, but to think about these much more in terms of the way that different spheres and cultures of publicness and privateness, different forms of exchange and interaction, are facilitated by the designation of different kinds of things, including data, as public and private. And to think about the ways in which the circulation of these various kinds of resources, goods, whatever you want to call them, within these different configurations, social configurations of publicness and privateness, actually lead to the production of different kinds of value. And I think that is the key thing that I want to leave you with here. That the issue is not of whether public or private ownership best serves the public good, but the way in which different configurations of the circulation of goods allow for the creation of different kinds of value in those different social configurations and social systems. As I say, I've not really said anything, as I said at the start, I'm not going to say anything really about public data, about human health data, personal health data, except just to say that, of course, these figure in all of these debates in various ways from the beginning, that human beings and their personal health data are involved in the way in which genomic research takes place right from the very beginning. It becomes important, for instance, especially in relation to the search for disease genes during the 1980s. Families and rare disease communities become important actors in the ways in which data can be collected. But this moves up to a very different scale of recruitment with the shift to interest in common complex disorders, when whole populations start to be recruited. And what counts as a population is an interesting question, but with the growth of biobanks, for instance, and genome-wide association studies, more and more people, including people with a wide range of health conditions, states of health, states of disease, and their complex bodies of data, health data that come with those, start to be recruited into genomic research. I think it's important, some of these are held in private hands. The case of Decode and the Icelandic population health database is one that's fairly well known. It's important, I think, though, to realise as well that there are enormous private genomic databases, including personal health data, held by clinical trial organisations and drug companies. It became, from the mid-1990s, quite routine for patients entering clinical trials to have their health data and their DNA added to a data bank or a biobank. So there are now as well, I mean, these issues of personal health data obviously raise all sorts of other questions beyond those that I've been considering. Questions of responsibility to the public, who participates, responsibility as well for how to deliver benefits in return for their participation. But in thinking about that, I do just want to say that, you know, this is not, again, I don't want the, I think my message would be that we don't just want to think about this in terms of public and private, about publicity and privacy, but again, to think about the ways in which those kinds of data too have value, or value is extracted from or created from those kinds of data, and the way that that needs to be seen in relation to the systems of circulation, the systems of research, the systems of interaction in which they're embedded. That is the point I want to leave you with. I think we've maybe got 5 minutes for questions. I'm not sure how you want to.
Thanks very much.